Hello everybody, my name is Seth Harris with Harris Home Improvement, and today in this video we are going to show you how to do polyurethaning to finish stained wood or unstained wood. Either way, to finish wood. Maybe I'll do a separate video on staining later, but just because it's so simple, I'm just going to go through the staining process real quick, and then we'll get into the polyurethaning process. Now, ideally, when staining, if possible, you want to stain while you're installing, right? So you cut each piece, you dry fit it. When it's good, you sand it, you stain it, you install it, right? And then you continue along. There's really not much to the actual staining process. I mean, you basically just make sure you mix up your stain with a stirring stick, not shaking it, right? Because shaking doesn't actually do anything. What you need to be doing is stirring up the sediment on the bottom of the can and getting that to float into the stain mixture. And then you use just any kind of rag, really, and you dip that in your stain and you squeeze it out and then you rub it on your surface. You could, if you wanted to, use a brush and brush it on. In the end, you still have to use a rag to wipe it back off anyways. So I usually just skip the brushing step and skip ruining a brush and just go straight into wiping it on with a rag because it accomplishes the same thing all in one fell swoop. So that's really all there is to staining, not much. When it comes to choosing your stains and urethanes, the important thing to remember is to stick with the same family, right? So if you want to put on a water-based urethane to finish with, which you especially would want to do if you're spraying the urethane on your finish, then you're going to want to use a water-based stain, right? And they have those today as well. If you use an oil-based stain, you're going to want to use an oil-based polyurethane. The reason being is while water can sit on top of an oil-based stain, what's going to happen is it's not really going to fully adhere. It's oil and water, right? They don't necessarily mix, which kind of begs the question, how do they create oil-modified polymers? They do exist. They do something to the oil, right? It's modified so that it mixes in with the water. But with an oil-based product, right, it's not modified for oil use, right? So if you put an oil-based stain on, your water-based polymer is not really going to fully adhere, and it will look good for a while, and eventually it'll start cracking and flaking off, right? So we use an oil-based stain here. We're going to use an oil-based polyurethane. Unfortunately, they are trying to phase oil out of existence. So nowadays you can only find these in quarts. So we have 4 quarts for this project instead of 1 gallon. And like a oil-based stain or like a stain in general, I'm going to want to mix this urethane by stirring it with a stick, not by shaking it, right? In the case of the urethane, the reason is because you want to minimize the bubbles. You're going to get bubbles, especially with your first 2 coats, no matter what you do. But anything you can do to minimize bubbles throughout the process you want to do, right? So for example, mixing or stirring rather than shaking, applying with a brush rather than applying with a roller, that's going to minimize bubbles. Obviously, if you apply with a roller, you're going to get a lot of bubbles. I made that mistake once. Never do that again. I've never used a foam roller. I don't know how well that works as far as bubbles are concerned. I've always used these white bristle brushes. It's the ancient method, and as far as I know, the ancient methods have been around for thousands of years because they work the best. Alright, this is probably mixed well enough. Now, I prefer to use oil in general just because it has a much better look when it comes to stained. Did I really just do that? When it comes to stained and urethaned projects. My favorite thing about the oil is the ambering effect that it has. And it really brings out the rest of the qualities in the wood that the stain doesn't. Yeah. Trying to be careful about how I pour it in there. Don't want to create too many bubbles. Like I said, it's all about minimizing bubbles. Now I'm going to fully secure this cap before I get to work for two reasons. Number one, there's still some urethane in there. I don't want somebody to come around and kick it, knock it over and spill it. Number two, I don't know if I'm going to be putting urethane back into that can later or if I'm going to be putting into another can, and I don't want the urethane on the side walls of that can to dry before I put my urethane back into it at the end of the day, right? Because now I'm getting solids into my paint, or in this case, polyurethane, and that's not cool, right? So that's another reason to fully secure the lid before going to work. Okay, so two most important things to know about applying your polyurethane is, number one, the drippage quality nature of polyurethane, right? You do not want to put this stuff on too thick. It will drip like crazy if you do, and it's really difficult to thin out to the proper level if you put it on too thick, right? So you want to start by constantly putting it on thin. Number two is always work with stopping points, right? You never want to stop in the middle of a piece, right? So stopping points, for example, are this entire piece of, since we're on that angle, this entire piece of trim here is one whole stopping point, right? If I start this piece of trim, I have to finish this piece of trim corner to corner before I can allow myself to be distracted and walk away from this work, right? And edge to edge. If I'm talking about one of these panels, right? Each one of these seams between these panels and each one of these seams at the corners where it meets the trim, those are my stopping points, right? So if I start this board, I have to finish this entire board before I can allow myself to walk away from my work, right? Now, if I polyurethane this board and I stop halfway through, and then I let that dry, and the next day I come and I polyurethane the other half of this, and I overlap, right, at that edge that I finished before, what's going to happen is there's now two layers of urethane at my overlap, and that's always going to be shinier than the single layer, the rest of it. So now even if I put a correct layer over the entire top of that, right, in one fell swoop, I'm still going to have that extra layer in the middle, and it's still going to be extra shiny on every coat thereafter, right? You're always going to be able to see that mistake. So that's why you always work from stopping point to stopping point, and seams are great stopping points, right? I can do one of these entire boards, you know, and then if I had to walk away and come back the next day, I can start with the boards around that without affecting the quality of that board, right? So that's the nature of our stopping points. So let's get into some actual strokage. How do we make sure that we're putting this oil on thick enough that it looks good, but not too thick that it starts dripping, right? So what you need to know is it only wants to go on so thin, right? It can't go on any thinner. If it's any thinner than that, it's not there at all, right? And so basically your object goal is to get it on as thin as possible while making sure it's actually there in every single crevice, right? Every single nook and cranny. So what you're not going to do, all right, is apply an oil-based polyurethane like a paint, right? And like a paint, you would dip it, you would push it into the brush, right? And then you would take that with the fat of that oil all over that brush, and you'd start slapping it on there and working it in. The reason you're not going to do that is because it's going to put a really thick amount at the beginning of your stroke in both directions and a thin amount towards the end of your stroke in the center, and it's going to be really difficult to thin those thick parts out and make it nice and uniform all the way across. So what you are going to do is after you dip it and squeeze it into your brush is you're going to take that excess and wipe it off the outside of your brush back into your container. Now you're not going to squeeze the bristles, right? You're not going to squeeze what's inside your brush out of your brush. You're just, you know, going to let the weight of the brush rest on your paint can or your bucket, right? And take that excess off the outside of the brush, right? So you still got plenty of polyurethane up inside the brush. There's just no excess on the outside. So now, when I draw my brush against the surface, it's drawing the polyurethane out of my bristles and onto that surface like through vacuum suction. And it's going to leave a nice even coat all the way through. And when I reach the end, right, when there's just not enough polyurethane inside my brush for it to like continue leaving anything on, and it's going to start drying out on me, it's going to create what's called drag, right? And I'm going to feel that drag. Even if I don't see it, I'm going to feel it with my hand. It's going to start pulling on me, right? A little bit stronger than it was at first, right? Because I got that polyurethane up, it's going to glide nice and smoothly. When it starts to dry out, it's going to start dragging on me, right? That's how I know I'm out of polyurethane. So now I'm going to back up. I'm going to go in the opposite direction, right? So coming a little closer so we can get an actual look at what we're doing here, maybe from this angle so you can see what I'm doing up in here. All right, so again, get the polyurethane on the brush, push it into the bristles, wipe the excess off the outside of the bristles, very little pressure. Now I'm gonna put my bristles on my work, and I'm gonna work it in, and I'm gonna go until I feel drag. And it's right about there. Right, I'm gonna go back up to the beginning of my work, where it's a little bit thicker, because that's where it first came out of my brush. And then I'm just gonna work it into these corners. Remember, stocking points, right? I'm gonna clean those edges after I get it up in there. Keep to my stopping point. I'm gonna work it down into this edge now. All right. And I'm just gonna go over my work. Really make sure it's actually worked into the texture of the surface now. All right, both directions, maybe even. All right, and this looks way better than that water does. See how it actually like brings out the color and gives it a shine? It doesn't just put shine on top of it. It actually like it brings out the color a little bit more too. That's why I love the oil. All right, now final thing is always very light pressure, finish strokes, right? That's gonna give it that like nice even splay all the way across that allows the oil to self-level really nicely and prevent any drips from happening, right? So now I'm going to, again, just dip it in there and then wipe the excess off after you push it into the bristles. I'm gonna come at this from the other side now. Right back into my previous work. Get this corner up in there. Now I'm intentionally like sticking to my stopping points here, right? Back into my old work. Now I'm just gonna really kind of make sure it's really worked into these, into the texture of the wood. All right, and finish strokes. All right, so that's one piece finished. I could walk away now if I wanted to. I'm not going to, obviously. I'm obviously not gonna do this entire thing in this video, but I'm gonna show you some trim pieces and some of these slats. So I'll do these two sides here, and then I'll do some slats. So trying to make sure I'm getting underneath on this guy, at least as much as I can. All right, and then light pressure, finish strokes. Dip, squeeze, wipe, apply. And some people assume, like, because you see, when you see the finished result, it's so thick, right? That's at least 3 coats of urethane being on it. So it's easy to make the assumption that, oh, you're supposed to, you know, really put this stuff on thick. No, you're actually not. It drips way too easily to be putting on thick like that. So again, you're always making sure you put it on real nice and thin. And the easiest way to do that is just to make sure that you always wipe the excess off the outside of your brush, right? That's where your drippage is going to come into play. It's going to put it on way too thick if you don't do that. All right, so I got my outer trim work done. Now, if you were doing this entire structure by yourself, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go around the entire structure and hit all the trim work first, right? It's easiest to do all your trim work first and then to do all your body, right? But obviously for the sake of this demonstration, I'm not going to do all of that because that would take forever. So as you can see, I got the 2 trim pieces done, you know, for what I'm going to work with next at this body contacts, right? So if I wanted to, I could let those 2 dry. If I needed to, I could come back tomorrow. I could do these body pieces without affecting the trim work, right? And that's why you do the trim work first, right? In case, let's say it takes you all day to do the trim work, well, now you can come back and you can do the body without affecting your trim, right? So here we are. I mean, really, the object goal at first here is just get it on there, right? Now this first piece is so small, I'm going to go right into my next board. I have plenty of urethane on here for both of these boards, so I'm going to go ahead and get them both. Maybe I don't. I mean, it's in there, it doesn't want to come to the front of my brush. There it is. Yeah, we got just enough. Alright, so notice I'm stopping here because you never know when you might get distracted. So you always work with your stopping points. Now, if this was the next day and this piece of trim was dry and I was doing this and I was getting under the layer on here, I would either take that as an opportunity to second coat it as I go, or I would take a rag and I would actually wipe it off as I go, because, you know, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. If I'm going to get more polyurethane on this piece, right, and it's dry, then I want to make sure I hit that whole piece again, right? So either I'll be second coating that as I go, or I'll be cleaning it off as I go. So imagine if this is already final coated, then I would definitely be cleaning that off as I final coat this. Unless, like in this case, we're doing it while these are still wet, in which case I can just stroke it off with my brush. Don't you get sexual on me. All right. So other than that, I mean, it's really, you know, it's not much to it. In many ways, it's kind of easier than painting because it's clear, you know, like, and our floor isn't here. So we got this plastic here for when we do up here in case it drips. But we don't have to worry about the floor. I mean, this is vertical. I mean, it'd be really hard to get anything on this surface. And if you do, I mean, it's way in there where our wood is in there, and you're not going to see it. But in any case, so moving along, right? The object goal is for a larger area like this, you know, first get the polyurethane on there and then do your finish strokes. I didn't do my finish strokes for these before, so I'm going to do them now. Add a little holiday in there. Alright. One of these dips seems to do about half of this board here. right, so I'll do maybe one more board for demonstration. So you can see what it's like when you do a longer section and multiple dips. And you see what I did there? I got like the bulk majority of the polyurethane out of my brush before I squeezed into the corner. This would be much easier to do if we had an angle brush. It'd be easier to get into these corners here without getting urethane on these trim pieces. But I couldn't find a white bristle angle brush that was 3 inches large, which you need for a large project like this. But in any case, if you get like the excess off your brush, right, before you go into the corner, then it doesn't squeeze so much urethane out of the brush and create so much thickness that you have to work with. Right. So every single time, always wipe that excess off. If you don't, you'll be dealing with drips. Always working into your stopping points, and then always, right, away from your edges and always back into your work. If you create a stroke in the middle of your work like this, what's going to happen is when that dries, it's liable to leave a line there. Now, this is an oil-based product. It's self-leveling. That's going to help you out a lot. But the general rule of thumb is always away from edges and back into your work, right? So that you can airplane off the surface, right? Leaving no lines behind, right? So everything looks nice and flat and uniform. Let's get the bulk excess off my brush, get it into this corner, squeeze it in there. All right, work it into that stopping point, cut it into that stopping point, work it into that stopping point. All right, and then make sure it's really in those texture of the wood, and finish strokes, finish strokes, finish strokes. All right, just like that. All right, and now, like, you can continue along doing the rest of the trim while you let that dry, and then even when that's dry, you can come and when you're ready to do the body, start right where I left off, right? Working from that stopping point, and as long as you don't get any urethane over onto this board once it's dry, you're good. While you can, like if you only wait like a couple hours before recoating, you can go ahead and recoat without sanding. That's what they say right in the directions, right on the can. I personally don't like to do that because every coat is going to leave behind some bubbles, right? Especially your first coat, right? And if you don't sand out those bubbles before putting on the next coat, then the next coat isn't going to fill in those bubbles, right? So the first coat is going to be the most difficult to sand because you have to be very careful. It's so thin and so easy to take the first layer of polyurethane off, but you do want to sand it just very lightly, very carefully to get those bubbles out before you put the next coat on. And other than that, every coat goes the same way as the last coat, right? The sanding does two things. And if you're going to wait and sand, okay, you always have to wait 24 hours, right, for it to fully cure before you sand it, right? It's got to be nice and hard. It can't be too soft. And that's why you can recoat it if you don't sand it, if you get to it fast enough, right? It's still soft, it's still tacky, it has something it can grab into, right? But if you want to get those bubbles out, you wait 24 hours for it to cure, become a little bit hard, sand those bubbles out, right? And then the sanding does two things. Not only does it get those bubbles out the surface, but it also scores the surface a little bit, right? 220 grit sandpaper is, well, not actually, 220 grit for a sand sponge is perfect. If you're going to use paper, it's best to use 320, I find, right? Because paper can be a lot more abrasive than a sponge can be, right? The sponge is going to be a bit softer. So I like to use 220 on a sponge, and if I have to use paper anywhere, then I use 320. And again, just very light pressure for the first sanding. The idea is just get the bubbles off, you know, score the surface just a little bit. so that the next coat has something to grab into. And then your next coat goes on just like the first coat here. And then your second coat, you can sand a bit more aggressively. Like, you don't want to apply too much pressure, and you don't want to be violent with your sanding, because that would be counterproductive. But you can apply more pressure, and you can be a little bit more aggressive than your first coat, so that your third coat really grabs on well, and your third coat should leave minimal bubbles behind. That'll finally reach its optimum level of thickness, its optimum level of shine, and it'll be perfect. And so we'll come back when we're done with the first coat. One thing I forgot to mention, since we're using oil here as opposed to water, right? Typical water cleanup, you can just clean your brushes out with water in a kitchen sink, no big deal. But with oil, right, the only way to actually clean it is with paint thinner or lacquer thinner, right? In this case, considering it's a lacquer, you would be using a lacquer thinner. But those are, very nasty products. They're not only very terrible for your health, along with the oil urethane, but, we're not touching the oil urethane with our hands. We would if we had to clean it. Like, that's the problem. And then, then there's the question, what do you do with, the leftover lacquer thinner that's now mixed with this polyurethane, and how do you, get rid of that without harming the environment, right? So what I do is I don't clean brushes. I think it's more environmentally friendly in this case to just let the brush dry and throw it out than it is to try and clean it. Yeah, that's very consumerist of me, just buying brush after brush after brush, but I think it's probably more economically friendly to buy more brushes than it is to try and clean them out in this case. So that's what I do. I just let the brush dry and I throw it out. I use another brush for every coat. If you need to, though, about the longest it'll last, because oil's not like a water-based paint, right? Even if you wrap it in plastic, it's still going to dry. It'll slow it down, but it's still going to dry. So, but if you need to, you can wrap an oil-based brush in plastic overnight. You just have to make sure it's really, really well sealed. And then as long as you're using it first thing the next morning, it'll still be good to go. Any longer than that, though, and it's going to start drying on you, and it's going to be unusable, and you're just going to have to throw it out and start with a new brush anyway. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add. What's up with this stubborn little spot right there?
It's the light, because it's been driving me nuts all day. Yep, I see what you're saying. I've been having to really hit it in the light. Like, once I'm done,
That's what I mean. Like, you have to really work it into the texture sometimes.
And it's been doing that. I actually want to check over there and make sure, because I was, even on that top right there, I had to keep looking down at like this, and I was seeing little dry spots, even though I know I hit. I'm like, a little.
Yep, you gotta watch out for that. Polyurethane likes to do that. It's good when you see that, though, because that means you're not putting it on too thick.
And to avoid those little dry spots, I'm noticing the slower the better. Because I was moving a little faster earlier, and it was like, every time I was looking at the board, there were more and more spots. Which we shouldn't have, I'm guessing, as much problems with that on the final coat.
I mean, it's the same, because the wood texture, the wood grain, right, has a texture to it that flows through every layer that goes on top, right? And after like 57 layers, it'll eventually round out, but for 3 layers, it's still gonna be there. So pretty much every coat we do is you're gonna have to really work it into that texture. See, because oil being self-leveling, it has a much higher viscosity than water, right? So it's going to want to, ball back up together into itself before really fully getting into the bottom of grooves of the texture, right? So you have to work a little extra hard to really work it into those bottom grooves of the texture, right? And the bottom grooves of, your sand marks. And then the tensile strength of the, what's it called again? Well, the elasticity of it will allow it to remain adhered to that surface without pulling away.
Which right now, the way that sunlight is coming through the window is my friend, because it's letting me see it.
Yeah, you have to move your head around a lot.
Yeah.
And obviously you don't want to have any of those holidays because they'll do the opposite of flashing on you.
Yeah.
It'll be a dull spot. I'm not seeing any drippage on this side.
No,
Not
well,
yet.
that's because, I don't know if you noticed when I was
You were dry brushing?
no, I'm just pushing down a lot harder to get more
Okay.
poly out of the
Okay.
brush, because, just the normal,
Right,
it
okay.
was drip city for
Okay.
a while.
So you're working with a drier brush now because
Yes. The second
working
coat
with a
was-
normal dry brush was it was going on too heavy. So the second coat wants to go on thinner than the first coat.
Definitely.
Okay. Final coat probably will too. That's also why the second coat is probably the hardest when it comes to filling in those holidays, because it wants to go on so thin. And so as you can see, when done properly, the third coat does it. It's so shiny. Yeah, we did a semi-gloss on this. I wanted this to pop. And it's not fully cured, but it is dry. What you're seeing here is dry. It's not wet. It's dry to the touch. It is beautiful.